Unfortunately, nitrates aren't the only threat to our health. And we've invited Mary Jo Forbord. She's going to be joining us right here via Zoom from Prairie Horizons, her family farm in western Minnesota. Mary Jo is a registered dietitian and fifth-generation farmer. She works to promote a deep understanding of the connections between health, soil, nourishing food, clean water, and healthy people. She's got a background in healthcare and community nutrition. She was the executive director of the Sustainable Farming Association and also worked as health eating coordinator at the University of Minnesota at Morris. So Mary Jo, thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, Iowa, and everyone online. It's nice to be with you. You've heard a lot of evidence this evening. I have a degree in science, and I want to tell you something that you don't often hear in science or maybe take seriously. It's an anecdote. It's an anecdote that is my life, and I have a short time here to talk, and probably about a minute a decade, as I figure. So I'm going to get started, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story, and you can probably weave some of the evidence in and out of this story because it may be a story that's quite common in farm country. I was born into a farm family in the 1950s. Everyone in our family of 7 had some kind of responsibility on the farm. It was just a given that the farm needed to feed the family and feed the animals and grow the crops and haul some of those cash crops to town to the elevators sell for living expenses. Life was outdoors. It was in the garden and in the fields and often in the kitchen, cooking and processing food for a large family, for work crew dinners. And then, as I remember my earliest days, the Shakopee Creek, this cool, gigantic cottonwood oasis that was just a short dash away from the farmhouse, clear, cold, flowing water, abundant fish. And then my earliest memory was of our farm flooding, 1957. The farm was underwater. Our animals became sick. I remember it being a time of tension and sadness. And not long after, the Shakopee Creek was dredged and deepened and channelized. All the cottonwood trees, the gigantic trees, were felled. And my dad was one of the first ones to tile in. Now we could predictably get a crop from what had been an intermittent wetland. Life was good. In the 1960s, I attended the same one-room country school that my dad and grandpa had attended, along with a dozen or so neighbor kids who traveled the same gravel road to and from school, the same 12 kids and the same teacher for 6 years. We had a telephone at the school, and that's where the news came that President Kennedy had been assassinated. We watched his funeral on television, which was the new technology of the day. Farming had become globalized with ever more pressure on exports to feed the world from our breadbasket, from our riches, from our Great Plains in the USA. But before the decade was out, my brothers had been drafted to the Vietnam War, and a river in Ohio had caught fire 14 times. And that caught enough attention of enough people that the first Earth Day was launched. I remember the 70s as being a time of civil rights and women's rights, everything from Kent State to Watergate. And for me, a ray of hope for better days ahead, for peace and for health. The Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs had released the first dietary goals for the United States that were shifting the dietary guidance from getting enough nutrients to avoiding too much foods that could lead to chronic disease. This is when I became a registered dietitian to unleash the power of nutrition and food to prevent disease, and the whole country seemed energized to do it. I didn't think my farm upbringing really had that much to do with it. The land went to women and not to men. My connection to the land would have been severed forever. And I perhaps wouldn't have even missed it because at the time, farming was a pretty much male thing to do. And further, it had sort of this aura that you did it if you couldn't do anything else. You had to get an education to get out, especially females. Well, surprise, the 1980s came and I married a farmer. And 5 years later, we bought the 480-acre dairy farm he grew up on, 20 miles from the farm where I grew up. We worked as hard as dairy farmers do and paid for the farm with the milk checks. We're proud of the product that we produced and how we produced it. And we fought the advent of biotechnology into farming, which was known as bovine growth hormone. But farmers, even organic farmers, were persuaded by the industry that if they didn't support this technology, those clueless consumers that you have to feed anyway would be standing on your neck and thwarting every new technology that is coming down the pike. It worked. Sound familiar? We're up to the 1990s, which is a very pivotal time for us when we nearly lost our unvaccinated herd of dairy cattle to an airborne virus. After a fairly slow recovery, we opted to take the advice of nearly everyone we trusted in the industry, namely, just do whatever you can to increase your production because the price of commodity milk is volatile and lots of times below the cost of production. Our veterinarian and our bovine nutritionist assured us we were only hurting ourselves by not adopting this technology, as most, maybe a third of the farmers had that were already on the milk truck. So our milk was shipped to Florida, and other tankers were bringing milk to Minnesota from happy cows in California. The food system really at that point stopped making sense. And I began to see more of the invisible strings controlling the commodity of farmer, especially when asked to sign a 12-page contract that redefined stewardship as protecting patented seeds that you bought but didn't own. These seeds held a very revolutionary technology that would withstand what we were told was a kinder, gentler herbicide, glyphosate. This would reduce herbicide use. That's when we really felt that to go that route of farming is something that we needed to try to escape from. And we began to plan our escape from that type of farming. It's not easy to do. But at the turn of the century, I feel that we were in luck. There was a brand new EQIP program from the NRCS that would help convert row crops to grass, cost share and infrastructure for grazing. And I was already looking into the nutritional attributes of grass-fed meat, which was higher in omega-3 and really the fat of the land, a very different kind of fat than a corn-fed animal. And then through some progressive leadership at the time from the Minnesota NRCS that led the nation in the organic transition, we began to convert the farm just field by field to organic. And surprisingly to us, after we got over our fear about what are we going to do if we're not using antibiotics, what are we going to do when the animals get sick, we began to enjoy the fewer inputs, especially farming without pesticides, the life that would spring up that we didn't even know about. So diversity exploded, and the land and the cattle were teaching us what they could do, and lots about farming with nature. It was a new day. But then the 2010s arrived, and this I call the brutal decade in farming, especially for us. It began with our 22-year-old son's funeral. For 15 months, we had battled synovial sarcoma, a rare but increasingly common form of childhood cancer. We battled it with everything we had and everything custom medical care had. Through 2 LifeLink air ambulances, 2 ground ambulance rides, 2 Thanksgiving at Mayo hospitals, only to spread his ashes here on his 23rd birthday on the farm he loved. So grief is an animal. It had me by the neck for many years. I couldn't talk. But then in 2016, Laverne, my husband, had a very grim and I won't have time to go into the gory details, but he was poisoned by a cocktail of chemicals from the farm across the way. Now our farmers are not neighbors. They're coming from 50 miles away and farm over thousands of acres and many counties. They're here to do a job. They don't care what the wind speed is. We know that the laws on the label is the law, but they won't be enforced. And the upshot is it's okay to lay huge piling rotted corpses of turkeys that have been euthanized during the avian flu and not at all composted and spread the bedding that it contains insecticides so that it goes across our organic acres. We learned during that there is no medical crosswalk from the agricultural chemicals to toxification in the ER is usually related to an overdose and not farm chemicals for most doctors. So we learned there is no crosswalk, and our regulatory systems that are supposed to protect us do not and will not. The good news is that my brother is a Hodgkin's lymphoma survivor. My sister is a salivary gland cancer survivor, and my other brother is a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma survivor. I am not a cancer expert, but I feel like it. The 2020s, we all remember COVID hitting. And for me, I was working on campus when it shut down. And I became a frontline worker and manager at the county food shelf that closed because its volunteers were of the age group that were said to, not be able to survive COVID. We had lots to do in flipping the food shelf. And that's when 45 years of a dietetics career, that was kind of my capstone project where indeed our food system does not make sense. It makes profits for some, especially for multinational ag suppliers. And here on the farm in the 2020s, we have the infrastructure for rotational grazing. And if you're familiar with the Conservation Security Program, it's a 5-year contract for whole farm management for ecological and restorative farming. After 3 contracts, 15 years of conservation, we have walked the gangplank of farm programs. There's nothing for us. So the only thing that we are supporting is the other side of the fence, which is killing everything but what the seed dealer owns, the supplier of the seeds that the farmer doesn't own. So that's our competition, and you're paying for that, and so are we. So we've accumulated these environmental benefits, and now it's up to us to maintain them on our own through our own subsidies. But in the meantime, we are subsidizing pollution, soil erosion, and monoculture, you and I, through crop insurance and other annual subsidies, mainly for corn and beans. They dominate, they rule, and back at the Shakopee Creek, CAFOs are proliferating and expanding. The Shakopee Creek is the most impaired tributary to the Chippewa River, which flows into the Minnesota River, which flows into the Mississippi, and likely coming to a tap near you. At least you may have municipal water treatment. Well owners, you're on your own completely. And I must say, this past summer, with the ending and the drought and the wind, it was the first time I thought of prairie fires, and I thought of ethanol, and I thought of all the corn, dried corn being right at the same time. And I hope we don't have to bleed all the resiliency out of the system and have our midsection of our country burned, because we have a whole lot of fuel out there that's ripe at the same time. So onward. When were we healthy and how do we regain health? Back to the good old days when type 2 diabetes was called adult onset because kids didn't get it. And now almost 50% of the diagnoses are under the age of 18. Do we roll it back to before petroleum, before plastics, before pesticides, before our water was polluted with all of the above? Plus the contaminants of emerging concern, that black box of stuff that we don't understand but are still leaving as a legacy to future generations. I think if given the choice, they'd take the clean drinking water. So thank you very much for inviting me. That's my anecdote.